Hello, welcome to my series discussing the evolution of Dungeons & Dragons from the early original edition released in 1974 through to the current 5th edition released in 2012. I'll take a look at each version to highlight the subtle and dramatic changes that have occurred since Dave Varson and Gary Gygax released the first commercially successful role-playing game on the world. So take your steps into the magical fantasy adventures made possible with D&D. Warning, here be dragons. Hello and welcome to the next video in my Edition Wars D&D series, and we've finally got to Advanced D&D, or First Edition as it's often referred to today. And this started coming out in 1977, and by 1981 we had all three versions available at a fairly decent price here in the UK. But when they first came out, I have a feeling they might have been as much as £15 each, which doesn't sound like much in today's money. But back in the 80s, £15 was a significant investment, and to get all three books for £45 would have been a lot. I believe when I bought them, they were £10 each. They might even have dropped to £8 at one stage. But interestingly, because they were so expensive to buy these premium deluxe hardcover versions, Games Workshop actually produced softback editions under license from TSR, and I was very tempted to pick that up, but I saved up my pocket money and bought these hardbacks. And these particular ones are not actually my original. All my original first edition stuff got sold off when I sort of quit school and my 8-year gaming campaign came to an end. So these are versions that I've picked up on eBay and various stalls and stuff when I've been going to game conventions over the years. So yeah, I've actually got a couple of the books. These are sort of my play copies rather than my master super, like keep them on the shelf copies. And also, rather irritatingly, they did actually produce a new version of each of these books with a new cover. But basically the contents were the same, which was quite irritating because I thought, oh, is this the new second edition? But no, it was just the first edition but with a new cover. And some people prefer the new covers, and I believe they have orange spines. But these are sort of the original versions, although, as we will discover, some of these are, second, third or even fourth printings of the original design. And I think this really established TSR and D&D as the premium product in the marketplace, because very few companies were competing with the quality of this product. And these are like 40, 50-year-old books, so they're in really, really good condition when you consider they're that old. And yeah, I think that just goes to show how TSR were not holding back the punches. Now, I think one of the problems for Advanced D&D is it was an attempt really to cynically cut out Dave from the D&D royalties, and obviously he got very upset, and Gary claimed that he wrote all three of these books, and yes, I guess he did, but without original D&D, these wouldn't exist, and they're more or less compatible. And when I played, I sort of started off with basic D&D, and then got the Monster Manual, the Player's Handbook, and eventually the Dungeon Master's Guide. So I think it took me about 2-3 years to collect all three books, and that did make things a little bit interesting. So although I claim to be a first edition player, strictly speaking, I'm a BX player who just happened to use the first edition books. And interestingly, I don't really view these as first edition. I view these as more like fourth edition, because you had the original white box. It then evolved with the original white box plus the supplements, particularly Greyhawk, which would effectively be the second edition. We then had the first basic set, which was a sort of rationalisation of original D&D, including Greyhawk. So the Holmes set is effectively the third edition of D&D. So by the time you get here, this is actually really the fourth iteration of Dungeons & Dragons. But it is the first edition of aD&D. And it all started with this book here, the Monster Manual, which came out in 1977. And it must have blown people away with this colour cover, the hardback, the 350 monsters, and the sort of well laid out interior that sort of rationalised how to describe monsters to a standard format. So this isn't actually a 1977 copy. This is a fourth printing, effectively, or fourth edition as it calls it here, August 1979. So it was such a popular book, they made multiple copies. We've got a bit of intro blurb, a nice alphabetical listing of all our monsters, and then sort of notes telling you how it all works with hit dice and how many appear and armor class and number of attacks and damage per attack, which is actually like how many dice you roll effectively, but you have to sort of intuit that. So for example, the beaver giant here, it's got all the stats, and then under damage per attack it's 4 to 16, so effectively 4d4. You know, rather than just write 4d4, he's put, it's 4 to 16. So in theory, you could do, I'll roll a d20 and -4, but minimum of 4. You could do all sorts of weird things, or roll 4d10, but, you know, maximum of 16. Obviously, 4d4 is the obvious way to do it. And what's interesting is if you actually look at this stat block, there's not really much here that would stop you using it in original D&D. Now, the alignment is possibly the area that you would have the most trouble with, but look at all these wonderful bits of artwork as well. I would say on the whole the quality is really, really good. Now we do still get some of these sort of cartoony looking images, but a lot of them are more what I call illustration, semi-realistic drawings, and it's just full of amazing pictures. And I remember just really enjoying reading about all these weird and wonderful creatures and looking at the artwork, and this was a brilliant book of 120 odd pages, so it's probably by itself almost as big as the original white box. Quite an achievement, and I can see why Gary thought this was his own pet project, because the amount of editorial writing and typing that he did was quite a massive piece of work for him. But you know, it's all really based on the core of D&D though, so yeah, bit naughty, but this is what, as I say, came out in 1977. I think it came out just after the Holmes basic set, so you know, it sort of came out maybe about a month after. So you know, if you bought the Holmes set, you could then buy the monster manual. You had loads of monsters, although many of them would be a bit challenging for characters of up to 3rd level. And you'd have to wait, I think it was at least a year before the other books came out. I think it was 78 for the Player's Handbook and late 78, early 79 for the Dungeon Master's Guide. So that's a little bit awkward for Advanced D&D, but it was well worth the wait. Now this is the absolutely iconic cover for the Player's Handbook, where you know, we're looking at a scene after an adventure has occurred. So we've got some poor lizard men being dragged around. We're looting the demon idol with our thieves up here. We've got probably a cleric conferring with maybe a henchman, who can tell. And then over on the other side here, we've got a fighter and a magic user having a chat. So we've got a table of contents showing you loads of stuff. And again, this is over 100 pages. A load of introductory fluff by Gary here. And then we go into quite a lot of detail explaining things, and the ability scores have been expanded with hit probability, damage adjustment, weight allowance, opening doors, bend bars. So there's loads of stuff that had been scattered across the white box, the supplements, dragon, have all been collated and put in here. So really this is a really good editorial job. I'm not sure how much is uniquely just down to Gary. We've got way more options. So we've got our racial stock, so dwarves, elves, gnomes, half-elves, halflings, half-orcs. You know, we've got more classes. So, you know, we no longer got the 3 core classes from the white box. We've got loads more, and then depending on your race and your class, you can adjust your stats, your XP, your level limits, and we have definitely separated race from class here. So unlike basic expert, you know, an elf isn't a magic user fighter. They're an elf who can then choose to be a magic user or a fighter or a multi-class. And as you can see, we've got the core classes here of cleric, druid, fighter, paladin, ranger, magic user, illusionist, thief and assassin, and then the sort of weird one, the monk, who's sort of almost like a martial artist, although weirdly I was thinking, well, is it like a Trappist monk? Is it a bit more like, you know, Name of the Rose, investigative monk guy? But you know, he uses bow sticks and joss sticks, or joe sticks, sorry. So this has got to be a sort of oriental type character, so it doesn't really fit into that pseudo medieval structure that D&D is using with, for example, Greyhawk. So there are some weird limits on weapons, and of course we've got variable weapon damage. The cleric now does actually get a spell at 1st level, which is something slightly different from original D&D. And yeah, as you can see, that there's loads of levels. So there's 7 levels of spells for clerics now, and there's typically 8 to 30 spells per level, so much more expanded. Got this absolutely stunning Paladin in Hell picture, and yeah, that's just lots more information. This is definitely the era of more is more, which, as I say, I think did make advanced D&D sort of start to strain a bit credibility. As you see, it talks about multi-classes. It's got the new alignment system, so instead of the law, neutral and chaos of original D&D, you've now got like chaotic evil, chaotic neutral, chaotic good, etc. And that makes it a little bit wonky. We've got loads more information about languages, the money systems being standardized to the sort of 10 copper to 1 silver, but interestingly it's 20 silver to 1 gold, whereas I think a lot of people just do 10 to 1, 10 to 1, 10 to 1. So that is slightly different and could catch you out. We've got loads of info about various weapons with how much they weigh and how much damage they do depending on whether you're a small, medium or large target, and are there any special notes, so like can it be used two-handed or 1.5-handed and all that sort of stuff, and what other weapon types does it include. And some of this is historically well researched, some's maybe a little bit more suspect. And then of course we've got this table that I think a lot of people ignored, which is adjusting your to hit chance versus AC. So like if you're using a flail, it would have no bonus against plate mail but would be really good against AC 7. Of course that goes a bit weird when you're considering it's meant to be about armor types rather than AC, because monsters might have a natural armor class of 2 but not be plate mail, and so well, does that mean the weapon adjustment works with it? So this is where the attempt to make it more realistic and a bit more rich and nuanced, I think, actually does it a bit of a disfavour. As you can see here, loads and loads of spells now for all the new magic using classes, so your cleric, your druid, your magic user and your illusionist, and some real classics in here, many of which sadly are not in the OGL, or they weren't in the OGL, maybe they are now with the new OGL that just came out recently. And yeah, a lot of the player's handbook is taken up with describing the spells, which now have this standard level, components, range, casting time, duration, saving throw and area of effect. And the components are interesting because you've got verbal, somatic and material, I think it was. And that's like, do you need to speak? Do you need to wave around your hands? Do you need to have some material? So again, that's something a lot of people maybe miss. Like, if you didn't have some Wolfsbane on you can't cast this spell. So you need to buy Wolfsbane to be able to cast this spell. And that's a level of richness that probably you should include, but often is a bit of a faff. It's maybe better to say if you've memorised a spell, you've got the components you need for it. We then get a load of stuff about going off dungeoneering and combat procedures, so there's a lot more detail and clarity here, which was sort of inferred or intuited in original D&D, so in some ways that's good. And I guess for a lot of us who know how to play D&D, this book helps with that. It also included psionics, which always felt a bit of a weird fix, and then buried right in the back in the appendices, we've got this weird class called the Bard, where you start off as a fighter and then a thief, or vice versa, and then once you've done that, you then get these sort of semi-magical abilities by becoming a Bard. And this is, I believe, pre the sort of horny Bard meme, but there's a nice diagram of the new alignment and then how that might tie into the planes, which got expanded in the Manual of the Planes book, and then we get a whole load of reference sheets. So as you can see, there's quite a lot here just in this, and this is over 120 pages if I remember. And then at the back here, we've got all the adventures that they're advising you to buy, many of which, of course, I did buy and did enjoy running. And this was brilliant. Using the basic and expert box sets with the player's handbook, you could get a really fun game. But eventually, I had enough money to buy this absolute monster of a book. Look how thick it is. It's definitely over 200 pages if I remember correctly, and this was where Gary just went nuts. I mean, look at it. These two books combined are probably equal to this chunky thing with another classic colour cover. So inside, as you can see, this is a 1979 printing, so a fairly early one. It's got a great big bit of introduction by Gary, and then how to approach the game, talks about dice and dice probability. And as he says in the introduction, he started working on this in 1976, so it took him 3 years to go from an idea to a finished product. So a nice little bell curve there for rolling 3d6. And talks about wishes, aging, and aging by your race, and then how that might impact your character abilities and all this sort of stuff, and how character abilities work. So lots and lots of detail here, and it's really Gary flexing his purple prose. And you either love it or you hate it, I guess. But when I was a wee lad, I just absorbed all of this, and it was just a fascinating book, which I read virtually from cover to cover multiple times. And there's just loads of really cool ideas in here, some of which I probably wouldn't bother using these days. I think, as I say, the more is more idea was actually a bad idea. I think less is better. Keep it simple. But as you can see, there's a load of stuff for rolling up various characters and animals and just generating random stuff using tables, which is really good if you don't want to sort of be too formulaic and keep coming up with the same ideas. Just roll on these random tables. There's stuff here about poisons, there's stuff about using a monster as a player character, including that fantastic picture at the top there of a dragon fighting a load of dog-faced kobolds. And yeah, there's just loads of really great ideas where you could take your game and change it to be this really uber game. And yeah, I think, as I say, I do wonder how many people actually played rules as written, every single option that's here. I mean, you probably can't, because some of them are sort of optional variants, like, well, you could do this or you could do that. I mean, it includes things like rolling 4d6 and drop the lowest die for generating your character, for example. It talks about alignment languages and rationalising what that is. That always felt a little bit odd to me, alignment languages. I mean, thieves can't, I sort of get, but all lawful characters being able to speak to each other regardless of culture or species just felt a little bit odd. But I guess, if you view it as a sort of mythic talking to your gods thing, fair enough. So we got a load of info here about armor classes and weapons, and I think there's even armor class saves for your weapons. There's hirelings, and there's loads of different hirelings. So this is where maybe you get to more campaign play style. You can actually like hire on ship's crew, merchants, sages, stonesmiths, all that sort of stuff. Lots of great stuff in here. Then we got a whole load more info about spells and clarifying how it might work. So lots of really, really great detail, which I think is going to be a real struggle to internalise. We then got a lot of info about combat and encounter reactions and missiles and initiative, which of course is different from Holmes, for example, which went on decks, which was sort of a sensible option, to be honest. Even talking about splash damage and boulders throw-in and how to cast spells and turning undead. So anything you might think of, I think Gary is trying to clarify and say, this is what I decree is how the game should work. And that's potentially really good stuff. He also talks about fatigue, and I think in a short while we're going to have randomising your dungeon and all that. And this would all be expanded on future books. So there's Unearthed Arcana, Oriental Adventures, the Wilderness Survival Guide, the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide, the Manual of the Plains, Deities and Demigods. So D&D would bloat up to this massive, massive thing. There's even a section here, as you can see, about monks. Then we've got first attack initiative, attack matrices for missiles. There's just so much stuff. Pummeling, grappling, wrestling. These were really important tables, which it was really handy to have the Dungeon Master's Guide rather than have to keep flipping to your DM's guide. So get your DM screen and see all the class versus armor class at all the different levels. Lots of info on turning dead, psionics. I mean, it just goes on, doesn't it? I mean, there is just so much here. And when I came to trying to make this video, I was really struck. What do I talk about? Another interesting change here is the saving throw table, which sadly has gone all blurry because the camera's focusing on my hand. But paralyzation, petrification, rods and staves, spells, that is slightly different from what came before. Obviously, I've already mentioned armor class and initiative, so lots of little things. I mean, there's stuff here about alcohol, insanity, adjustment of your experience based on how tough the monster was. So this is where sort of defeating your monster, typically by killing it, became more important than looting gold. And I'm not sure if that was a good thing. I think looting gold was the way to go. We then got setting up your campaign and lots of really good ideas about different types of rulers and different sort of terrain and towns and social levels, and who might actually be in each of the hexes that you're building. And this is, as I say, another masterclass of ideas, many of which you might reject, but you can't deny Gary really was going for it. There was an example of play we flipped past there. Then there's various randomized traits you can do. Building construction here, so cost and GP. So this expands on that section that was in the books that came before. Then there's bits about converting to other games that TSR makes. So here we got a bit about Boot Hill, and then we've got a bit about Gamma World. So you can take characters from Gamma World and drop them into D&D or vice versa. And I'm not sure how many people did this, and it's an interesting idea, sort of almost creating a multi-genre, multi-universe version of TSR games. So yeah, some really interesting ideas there that are definitely worthwhile looking into. And if you tried it, obviously let me know. We then going into things about artifacts and magic and holy and unholy water and researching stuff. And again, this is just so much really cool stuff to create a game that you almost don't need to play another game, and that is sort of what a lot of people did. Now, as you can see here, you've got columns in magic items to fill in, and someone obviously did pencil in stuff before, which annoys me greatly, but there you go. And here's the random dungeon bit, including, if I remember correctly, there's some appendices for set dressing. We've got monsters here. I mean, just look at it, it just goes on and on, table after table after table of random rolls to help populate stuff. Another great full page black and white illustration there. We then got another table summarising all the monsters effectively in the monster manual, so you could almost argue, do you need the monster manual? But yeah, here you go. After this we've got some more stuff about the dressing, so smells, noises, items, so like robes, sandals, honey, jam, all sorts of weird, wonderful stuff that you can just randomly generate to populate your dungeon. And I'm sure lots of computer programs probably took advantage of this. And yeah, I mean, I think you're better off handcrafting it yourself, but maybe roll up some things and then go, okay, I've got some ideas, let's tweak them. I mean, here's another brilliant bit about talking about magical substances. So it could be bubbling or fuming or syrupy, it could be acidic. So really, really cool ideas just to inspire you, if nothing else. And I think that's where this is a real strength. I wouldn't necessarily use it raw, I would use it as inspiration. What have we got here? Oh, various items, educational reading, so the infamous Appendix N. So obviously Tolkien is featured here, but there's also all sorts of other stuff. Including H.P. Lovecraft, interestingly, which did cause a bit of problems with the Deities and Demigod rulebook, which I happen to be lucky to own the version with the mythos entities in it, but they unfortunately pulled that due to a little bit of concern over copyright and yeah, a little bit of misunderstanding with Kayazian by the sounds of it. Then we get, to top it all off, a glossary. So, just the amount of work to type this all up and create it was pretty impressive, and I think that's why Gary thought this was his own unique product. Unfortunately, a lot of the pages aren't numbered, which is really annoying, but we're over 170 pages before we get into the unnumbered pages. So yeah, a big chunky book, and as I say, all by Gary, no one else, allegedly, according to the covers, but obviously it was built on the foundation of D&D. So yeah, these here, if you look, I think they're about 120 pages each, these other books. So you're looking at 500, maybe 600 pages to get the complete core Advanced Dungeons and Dragons rules and info. But of course then he went on to produce all these other books, and it became a bit of a money printing machine. But as I say, I think it was a bit of the downfall of the Dungeons and Dragons game. And my interest in the game, once you get to second edition and later, really dropped off a cliff. I had explored a lot of the information in these books, and I'd played it for 8 years, multiple hours. I mean, probably 3 hours a day for 8 years. So that was a lot of play, and I very much felt done with D&D, and I thought it started to have problems, the sort of hand-wavy abstractness of it. stopped really working for me, but I have come to reappreciate them, and that's why I did pick them up again. But I think once you get past this, D&D started trying to become more realistic to keep up with the new hotness, like, Ring Quest, Call of Cthulhu, Traveller. And I think it didn't really work. I think its original design was abstract, and in many ways I do find original D&D more appealing, but let's be honest, most of the retro clones are based on BX, which is probably the best version of D&D. But I think from a quality of production, from a sheer intellectual virtuoso, peak D&D is first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And if you haven't got a copy of these, try and hunt them down. Obviously it's getting a bit expensive to buy original hardbacks, but you can buy PDFs, or alternatively the very nice pod print on demand copies that Drive-Thru does. Sadly, you won't get these lovely covers. They have if I remember, sort of a faux leathery brown look with a little circle with a sort of a snapshot of the original covers, which is a great shame, because although these covers maybe are a little bit naive compared to modern artwork, they have a charm all of those own, and the Player's Handbook is an image that's just seared into my mind. The Monster Manual is my least favourite, but it's an iconic image, and it was sort of given tribute to in Castles and Crusades with their creature book, where it had a sort of a variant cover that was very reminiscent of the original design. Now, there are multiple printings of these books. As you see, I've got sort of like first printing to fourth printing, and that's going to affect its pricing, the fonts, the spine colour, whether it's got any errata in it or not. But yeah, pretty much all of them are perfectly good. The only thing where you might have problems is if you pick up the Deities and Demigods book, because that later got renamed to Legends and Lore, and depending on which version you get will depend on whether you've got artwork or mythos creatures inside. And so the early printings of Deities and Demigods are quite valuable now, because they've got material that was pulled in later releases. But all you actually need to play the game are these 3 books. You don't need any of those extra books. And of course, adventures. Now, you can buy the modules, or you can just make up your own stuff. I do a bit of both. And yeah, the classic series of Keep on the Borderland, followed by the Slavers, the Giants, the Drow, to the Queen of the Demon Webs. I mean, that's an epic mega campaign that you can play for multiple months. In fact, in theory, it'd take you years to play, because leveling up was a little bit slower, and also staying alive was a little bit harder in these older versions of the rules. And I would say, if you're going to play Advanced D&D, either pick up Original, Basic Expert, or this. I personally, I'm not a big fan of 2nd edition, really don't get along with 3rd edition. 4th edition's very good game, but it's not D&D for me. 5th edition, it's okay, but I've got these originals, so for me, if I'm going to play a D&D style game, it's going to be sort of 1981 or earlier editions, and that's going to make it difficult for me to continue my videos talking about the various editions, because I have less experience with later versions than this. But I might do a video on all the extra expansion books with C, but I wanted to get this video out in 2024 because it is the 50th anniversary of the creation of D&D and the role-playing industry, and this, as I say, was probably the peak of TSR's efforts, and I think it went a bit downhill from then on, and of course eventually they went bankrupt and got bought out by Wizards of the Coast, and the rest is history, as they say. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this very quick look at this. So the key differences: race and class are separated. Armour class now goes from 10 rather than 9. Initiative is slightly tweaked, and there's loads of various rules and expanded attributes. So like strength is now at 18. If you're a fighter, you can roll for percentile, so effectively 19 and above, which is weird, but it's there. The psionics, which were again all really in original D&D. If you bought all the supplements, almost everything that's in Advanced D&D you can actually find in original D&D in the supplements, which is why obviously Gary's claim that this was a unique, totally separate product line, bit spurious, but I can sort of see where he was coming from, because this was a real tour de force by Gary, and he obviously wrote a lot, edited a lot, collated a lot of information, and really poured his heart and soul into producing these, and then invested a lot of money to produce these wonderful quality products. So anyway, there you go. That's it. I hope you've enjoyed this brief look, and until the next one, happy gaming.